The rhythmic, authoritative click of Cashin Vetro's Italian leather shoes against the sterile hospital tile echoed like a death knell in the quiet VIP wing. Clad in a sharp $5,000 suit that served as armor against the world, Cashin moved with a cold, untouchable air, his mind already calculating the next move in a brutal underworld war. He had come to room 402 to silence a liability, not to be shattered by a memory. He pushed the heavy door open with the effortless entitlement of a man who owned the city, but the command on his lips died instantly. The air inside didn't smell of gunpowder or betrayal, it smelled of antiseptic and soft baby powder. Cashin froze mid-step, his wide eyes and parted lips betraying a sudden, raw vulnerability that would have horrified his enemies. There, seated upright in the hospital bed with a quiet, guarded strength, was Zaire Blackwell, the maid he had dismissed 9 months ago after a drunken night he'd spent trying to forget. She wasn't the powerless girl he remembered. She was a mother, holding a peaceful, swaddled bundle that possessed his unmistakable jawline and hauntingly familiar eyes. In that silent, heart-stopping moment, the mistake he had discarded became a living reality, and the cold mafia kingpin felt the first cracks in his emotional armor. Stick around until the very end to see if Cashin chooses his empire or his bloodline. If you're ready for a story of betrayal and redemption, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss a chapter. The air in the hospital room remained frozen, but for Cashin, the sterile white walls began to dissolve into the hazy, amber-lit memory of 9 months ago. It was a night fueled by high-proof bourbon and the crushing weight of a botched shipment, a night where his ironclad discipline finally snapped. He remembered the way the rain had lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, and how Zaire, moving quietly to clear the crystal decanters, had been the only soft thing in his jagged, violent world. In his drunken stupor, she wasn't just the maid who kept his life in order, she was a sanctuary. But the morning light had brought a brutal, sobering clarity. Cashin remembered waking up with a searing headache and a cold realization of the line he had crossed. A mafia boss did not slip up with the staff. He did not show a pulse to those who saw his unmasked face. As Zaire had stood by the heavy mahogany door, her eyes searching his for a glimmer of the man who had held her hours before, Cashin had put on his armor. He didn't look at her. He couldn't. Instead, he had reached for his checkbook, the scratching of the pen the only sound in the room. "There is enough here to ensure you never have to work again," he had said, his voice as cold and sharp as a razor. He had handed her the dismissal, a piece of paper meant to erase a night of intimacy. He told her she was a distraction he couldn't afford, a mistake that needed to be scrubbed from his ledger. He had watched her chin tremble, watched the silent dignity in her posture as she took the check, but he had mistaken her shock for greed. He had dismissed her from his house and his life, retreating back into his world of power and fear. For 9 months, there had been nothing but silence. He had convinced himself that she was gone, a ghost of a momentary weakness. He had returned to his goals, protecting the Vetro Empire and surviving the constant threats to his life. He had forgotten how to listen to those he deemed powerless, believing that money had settled the debt. But as the flashback faded and the reality of the hospital room rushed back, the silence was shattered by the soft, rhythmic breathing of the infant in her arms. Cashin realized then that while he had been playing a game of shadows and legacy, Zaire had been carrying the weight of his bloodline alone. The mistake hadn't disappeared, it had grown, survived, and now sat before him with his own defiant stare. The coldness that had served as his shield for decades began to crack, replaced by a terrifying, unfamiliar heat. He had spent his life building an empire of stone, only to find that his true legacy was wrapped in a white hospital blanket, held by the woman he had tried so hard to forget. Cashin took a step forward, the heavy click of his boots on the linoleum sounding like a heartbeat in the stifling silence of the room. The air felt thick, charged with the weight of everything unsaid over the last 9 months. Zaire's grip tightened instinctively on the bundle in her arms, her knuckles turning white against the pale fabric of the hospital gown. She looked up at him, her expression a mix of guarded defiance and weary strength, but Cashin's gaze was already drifting downward, drawn by an invisible, magnetic force to the tiny face nestled against her chest. As he reached the edge of the bed, the newborn stirred. Small, restless hands fumbled at the edge of the swaddle before a pair of eyes blinked open. In that moment, the breath left Cashin's lungs as if he had been struck. He wasn't looking at a stranger, he was looking into a mirror of his own soul. The infant's eyes were a piercing, haunting shade, the unmistakable Vetro eyes that had been passed down through generations of men who ruled with blood and iron. They were eyes that didn't just see, but seemed to demand even at hours old. He saw the high, stubborn arch of his own brow and the sharp, defined line of his jaw mirrored in the child's soft features. The boy, Noir, yawned, a small and fragile sound that echoed louder than a gunshot in Cashin's mind. This wasn't just a child, this was a legacy. This was the bloodline he had spent his entire life protecting, now manifest in the most vulnerable form imaginable. The cold, methodical logic that usually dictated Cashin's every move failed him. He had spent years ensuring no one could ever get close enough to hurt him, yet here was a tiny human who had bypassed every guard and every wall without saying a word. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. The cleaning house of his life had left behind the one thing that truly mattered. He had built an empire on fear and power, but looking at Noir, he saw a future that didn't require a crown of thorns. The vulnerability he had always despised now felt like a living weight in his chest. For the first time in 34 years, the Mafia Boss, the man who never flinched, felt his hands tremble. He was no longer just a kingpin. He was a father, and the world outside that hospital door had just become 10 times more dangerous. The silence in the room was a heavy, suffocating shroud that Cashin finally broke with the only language he knew, the language of transactions. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit, his movements robotic and stiff, and pulled out a leather-bound checkbook. He didn't look at Zaire as he began to write, his pen scratching against the paper with a frantic, rhythmic intensity. He spoke without looking up, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that attempted to reclaim the authority he had lost the moment he saw the baby's eyes. "There is a private jet waiting at Teterboro," he muttered, the check trembling slightly in his fingers as he ripped it from the book. "This amount is 10 times what I gave you before. It's enough for a villa in Switzerland, a new name, and a life where no one knows who I am or where this child came from. Take the boy and leave before the sun comes up. I'll have my men escort you to the tarmac." He held the paper out, expecting the same silent compliance he had received 9 months ago, the same transactional exit that had allowed him to sleep at night. But the paper stayed suspended in the air, ungrasped. Zaire didn't even glance at the numbers written on it. Instead, she adjusted Noir in her arms, her gaze lifting to meet Cashin's with a searing, quiet fury that made the powerful Mafia Boss feel suddenly, inexplicably small. The woman who had once moved like a shadow in his penthouse now stood her ground like a mountain. "You think your blood is just another debt you can settle, Cashin?" she asked, her voice steady and echoing with a strength that chilled him. "You threw me away like a broken glass when I was just a mistake to you. But this boy is not a mistake. He is not a distraction, and he certainly isn't for sale." She leaned forward, the sterile light of the hospital room catching the tears of rage in her eyes. "Keep your blood money. I don't want your jet, and I don't want your name. What I want is for you to look at your son and realize that for the first time in your life, you've found something your checkbook can't fix." Cashin's hand dropped, the check fluttering to the floor like a fallen leaf. He had spent his life believing that every person had a price and every problem a payoff, but as he stared into Zaire's defiant face, he realized the rules of his world didn't apply here. He had offered her a way out, but her refusal had trapped them both in a far more dangerous reality. By rejecting the payout, she wasn't just claiming her dignity, she was forcing him to face the one thing he feared most, a responsibility he couldn't walk away from. The heavy silence following Zaire's rejection was punctured not by words, but by the sharp, metallic click of a safety being disengaged in the corridor. To anyone else, it might have been the sound of a falling tray or a heavy door, but to Cashin Vetro, it was a sound that triggered a decade of survival instincts. His head snapped toward the small glass window in the hospital door. For a fleeting second, a shadow eclipsed the light from the hallway, a silhouette that didn't move with the hurried gait of a nurse or the sluggishness of a patient. Cashin's blood turned to ice, shifting instantly from the emotional turmoil of a father to the cold lethality of a kingpin. He realized with a jolt of adrenaline that his sudden, unscheduled detour to this wing hadn't gone unnoticed. He had been followed. Whether it was the Council of Families looking for a crack in his armor or a traitor from within his own inner circle, his presence in room 402 had painted a massive target on the very door he had just walked through. "Get down," he hissed, his voice dropping into a low, terrifying command. He didn't wait for her to question him. He moved with a predator's speed, crossing the small space and placing his large, calloused hand on Zaire's shoulder to force her and the baby lower into the protective frame of the bed. The guarded defiance in Zaire's eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp terror as she saw the look on Cashin's face. She didn't scream, she simply pulled Noir closer to her heart, her body becoming a shield for the child. Cashin reached behind his back, his fingers wrapping around the cold grip of his suppressed handgun. He kept his eyes glued to the gap beneath the door. The shadows were moving, 2, maybe 3 men, stepping with the methodical patience of hunters who knew they had cornered their prey. He realized his mistake. In his rush to confront his past, he had forgotten that he lived in a world where every move was watched, and every secret was a weapon to be used by his enemies. If they were here, it meant the discarded maid was no longer a secret. It meant that his greatest vulnerability was currently trapped in a room with only one exit and a thin wooden door. The stakes had shifted from a private dispute to a high-level underworld war in the blink of an eye. If he failed to hold that doorway, his entire legacy, the empire he built and the baby he had just met, would be erased before the sun hit the horizon. The tires of the blacked-out SUV screamed against the asphalt as Cashin tore away from the hospital, the scent of burnt rubber and adrenaline still hanging thick in the air. Beside him, Zaire sat in a state of catatonic shock, her arms locked around Noir as if her own flesh could stop a bullet. Cashin's hands were steady on the wheel, but his mind was a storm of tactical calculations. He couldn't take them back to his penthouse, that was the first place they would look, and he couldn't leave them in a hotel. He needed somewhere invisible. The sanctuary was a sprawling, secluded estate tucked behind miles of wrought iron fencing and ancient oaks on the outskirts of the city. To the world, it was an abandoned colonial manor. To the Vetro family, it was a fortress. As the heavy gates hissed shut behind them, Cashin finally exhaled, but the tension in the car didn't dissipate. He led Zaire through the grand foyer, where the marble floors and crystal chandeliers felt cold and mocking in the dim light. He guided her to a suite on the second floor, a room draped in heavy silks and furnished with priceless antiques, but as Zaire looked around, her face didn't show relief. It showed a new kind of fear. "You'll be safe here," Cashin said, his voice regaining that low, gravelly authority as he gestured to the 2 armed guards already taking positions at the end of the hallway. "My best men are on the perimeter. No one enters these grounds without my personal code. Anything you or the boy need, clothes, medical supplies, food, it will be brought to you within the hour." He moved toward the window, pulling the heavy velvet curtains shut, plunging the room into a luxurious, artificial twilight. Zaire stood in the center of the room, still clutching Noir, looking less like a guest and more like a prisoner of war. The silence of the estate was a jarring contrast to the chaos they had just escaped. "Safe?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and resentment. "You've traded one cage for another, Cashin. Downstairs, there are men with guns. In here, there are cameras. This isn't a sanctuary, it's a vault where you've hidden your latest mistake." Cashin turned, his silhouette tall and imposing against the dark curtains. He wanted to tell her that this was the only way, that the world outside was currently hunting for a weakness he didn't know he had until an hour ago. He wanted to explain that in his world, a gilded cage was the highest form of love he knew how to offer. But the words felt hollow. He watched her lay Noir down on the silk sheets of the oversized bed, the infant looking impossibly small against the opulence. Cashin realized that while he had successfully moved them behind stone walls, he was still miles away from the woman he had once dismissed. The heavy oak doors of the study remained closed, but the world inside was a jarring collision of 2 lives that were never meant to meet. Cashin sat behind a desk that had seen the signing of death warrants and million-dollar contracts, but his focus was no longer on the ledgers. In his left arm, he awkwardly cradled the small, warm weight of Noir, while his right hand gripped a secure burner phone. The baby was restless, let out a tiny, high-pitched whimper that seemed to vibrate through Cashin's expensive silk shirt. "I don't care what the cost is, Marco," Cashin barked into the phone, his voice a low, lethal growl that had made grown men tremble. "If the shipment is delayed by the council, you burn the warehouse. No witnesses. No trail." As he spoke, Noir's small hand fumbled upward, grasping the lapel of Cashin's suit. The Mafia Boss froze, his ruthless command dying in his throat. He looked down at the infant, whose piercing vetro eyes were wide and curious, seemingly judging the violence in his voice. Cashin's posture shifted, the rigid, predatory stance of a kingpin softened into something clumsy and uncertain. He adjusted his arm, terrified that the strength he used to break enemies might accidentally bruise the fragile life he now held. "Boss? You still there?" Marco's voice crackled through the speaker, laced with confusion. "I'm here," Cashin snapped, but the edge was gone. He stood up, pacing the length of the room with a rhythmic, swaying motion he hadn't known he possessed. "Double the guards at the north perimeter. And tell the capos I'm unavailable for the sit-down tonight. Family business." He hung up before his underling could question him. The family usually meant the syndicate, the blood-soaked business of power, but as Noir finally settled against his chest, falling into a peaceful sleep, Cashin realized the definition had changed. He was barking orders to maintain an empire, but for the first time, the empire felt like a secondary concern. He was learning a new kind of warfare, one where the objective wasn't to take territory, but to protect a heart that beat in rhythm with his own. He was a man who dealt in death, now desperately trying to master the art of keeping someone alive. The weight of the baby felt heavier than the crown he wore. Cashin knew his men would eventually see the change in him. They would see the distraction, the soft spot in his armor. In his world, a man who loved anything was a man who could be destroyed. Yet, as he looked down at his son, the fear of losing his power was eclipsed by a terrifying, new realization. He would burn the entire city to the ground before he let a single shadow touch the child in his arms. The silence of the safe house was shattered by the heavy, rhythmic thud of combat boots approaching the study. Cashin didn't need to look up to know it was Dante, his second-in-command and the man who had bled beside him in a dozen street wars. Dante didn't knock. He swung the door open, his face a mask of cold fury that mirrored the storms Cashin used to summon. He stopped short, his eyes darting from the high-security monitors displaying thermal perimeters to the sight of Cashin, standing by the window, adjusting a small heater to ensure the room remained at a perfect temperature for the sleeping infant. "The council is meeting in 3 hours, Cashin," Dante said, his voice a low, vibrating rasp that carried the weight of the entire syndicate. "They're asking why the head of the Vetro family has gone dark. They're asking why 6 of our best hitters are guarding an old colonial house instead of securing the docks." He took a step forward, his shadow stretching across the mahogany desk. "And I don't know what to tell them. Because I don't recognize the man standing in front of me." Cashin turned slowly, his expression shifting back into the familiar, frozen mask of the boss, but the transformation was incomplete. "The docks are handled, Dante. My orders haven't changed." "Your orders are being questioned because you're distracted by a ghost," Dante hissed, stepping into Cashin's personal space, his hand resting significantly on the hilt of his tactical knife. "We all knew about the maid. We thought you handled it. We thought she was a mistake you paid to disappear. But now you've brought her into the heart of our operations. You've given our enemies a map to your jugular." He gestured toward the ceiling, toward the room where Zaire and Noir were hidden. "That woman and that child are a death sentence for this family. If the council finds out you've been compromised by a bloodline you didn't even want 9 months ago, they won't just take your seat. They'll take your head." The air in the room grew thin as Cashin stepped closer, his eyes flashing with a lethal, paternal instinct that dwarfed Dante's professional coldness. "You speak of the Vetro bloodline as a weakness," Cashin said, his voice so quiet it was terrifying. But that boy is the only thing in this city that isn't a lie or a contract. He is a vetro. And if you, or the council, or any man in this syndicate mistakes my protection for a distraction, you will find out exactly how much blood I am willing to spill to keep him safe. Dante didn't flinch, but the tension between them snapped like a frayed wire. The loyalty that had held the organization together for a decade was beginning to rot from the inside. Dante looked at his boss not with respect, but with the calculating gaze of a predator sensing a wounded leader. He turned to leave, but paused at the threshold. A king who builds his throne on a cradle is a king who's ready to fall. Cashin. Don't expect us to fall with you. The predator's silence that had defined the estate for days was shattered not by a voice, but by the concussive thump of a flashbang detonating on the front lawn. The monitors in the study hissed into static as the perimeter was breached, and the house groaned under the weight of an organized assault. Cashin didn't hesitate. He didn't reach for the encrypted laptop containing the keys to his offshore accounts, nor did he grab the briefcase holding the ledgers that could bring down the council. For the first time in his life, the empire was worth nothing. He sprinted toward the stairs, his handgun drawn and his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The hallway was already filled with the acrid scent of gunpowder. Below, the sound of splintering wood and muffled gunfire told him his own men were being overrun, either by the council's hitmen or by Dante's betrayal. Cashin kicked open the door to the nursery suite, finding Zaire standing in the center of the room, her face pale but her hands steady as she clutched Noir. "Follow me and do not stop," he commanded, his voice a jagged blade of urgency. They moved through the servants' passage, a narrow artery behind the velvet-draped walls. As they reached the back exit, the door at the end of the hall was kicked off its hinges. Dante stood there, flanked by 3 men in tactical gear. He didn't look at Cashin, his eyes were fixed on the baby. "The council wants the line ended, Cashin," Dante said, raising his weapon. "Drop the girl and the brat, and you walk away with your life and the business. Choose the chair or the child." The choice was a ghost. To Cashin, there was no empire without the blood that beat in the boy's chest. He didn't answer with words. He pushed Zaire behind a stone pillar and lunged into the line of fire. The air became a storm of lead and plaster. Cashin moved with a reckless, terrifying ferocity, shielding the path to the cradle with his own body. He took a graze to the shoulder, the heat of the bullet a dull reminder of his mortality, but he didn't falter. He fired with surgical precision, dropping the 2 men behind Dante before diving for cover. In the chaos, Zaire saw her opening. She didn't wait for a hero. She grabbed a heavy brass lamp from a side table and swung it with all the desperate strength of a mother, catching Dante's arm just as he aimed for Cashin's head. The momentary distraction was all Cashin needed. He surged forward, tackling his former brother-in-arms through the glass French doors and onto the terrace. They tumbled into the dirt and glass, but Cashin was the first to rise, his boot heavy on Dante's chest. He looked back through the shattered door to see Zaire hovering over Noir, shielding him from the debris. The briefcase, the throne, the billions in untraceable assets, they were burning inside the house, and Cashin didn't even turn his head to look. He had chosen the cradle, and in doing so, he had burned the only world he had ever known. The smoke from the ruins of the safe house had barely cleared when Cashin Vetro walked into the grand hall of the syndicate's downtown headquarters. He didn't look like a man who had just lost his fortune. He looked like a man who had finally found his purpose. His suit was torn, his shoulder was bandaged beneath the dark fabric, and his face was set in a mask of grim, absolute resolve. Behind him, Zaire walked with her head held high, no longer a maid or a victim, but a queen consort returning to a throne she never asked for. In her arms, wrapped in the same white hospital blanket, Noor slept through the heavy silence of the room. The remaining capos and the elders of the council stood in a semicircle, their faces a mixture of shock and opportunistic hunger. They had heard of the explosion, the betrayal by Dante, and the supposed fall of the Vetro line. They expected a broken man to come crawling for their mercy. Instead, they found a king who had traded his crown for a sword. Cashin stepped into the center of the hall, his presence commanding the very air. He didn't offer an apology, and he didn't ask for a vote. He reached out, and for the first time in front of his men, he took the child from Zaire's arms. The movement was no longer clumsy. It was the gesture of a man claiming his future. He held the infant up, the light of the chandeliers catching the unmistakable, piercing flash of the Vetro eyes as the boy stirred. 9 months ago, I made a mistake. Cashin's voice rang out, a low, tectonic rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. I believed that power was something built with ledgers and fear. I believed that people were disposable tools in the service of an empire. I was wrong. He turned his gaze to the council members, his eyes promising a slow death to anyone who dared to blink. This is Noir Vetro. He is my blood, my heir, and the new face of this family. And the woman beside me, Zaire Blackwell, is the reason this line survives. From this moment forward, she is untouchable. To look at her with disrespect is to challenge me. To move against her is to invite the total annihilation of everything you own. A heavy, pregnant silence followed his declaration. One of the elder capos took a tentative step forward, his mouth opening to cite the old codes and the purity of the chair. But Cashin didn't give him the chance to speak. He didn't need a consensus. He had a legacy. He handed Noir back to Zaire with a tenderness that chilled the room more than any threat could. It was the shift in his soul, the realization that he was no longer fighting for a seat at the table, but for the safety of a cradle, that made him more dangerous than he had ever been. The era of the cold, solitary boss was over. The new reign had begun, built not on the ruins of the past, but on the strength of a man who had finally learned that true power isn't the ability to dismiss a life, but the courage to protect one. The Vetro name has a new meaning, and the world now knows that Cashin will burn it all down for his family. Thank you for watching this journey of blood, betrayal, and redemption until the very end. If you want to see what happens next in the new era of the Vetro Syndicate, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a chapter.